So I'm going to talk tonight about religious life in 1911 Charlotte. I won't go into too much of this introductory detail since we've already been over it, but I will say that my project is based on the 15,711 records from the Charlotte City Directory. So I will explain how I used OpenRefine to clean that data, and then how I used Tableau Public to visualize it. I'll also talk about what I learned from the data and what questions I still have. I've included a list here of the computational thinking practices that this exercise uses. It's primarily data practices and computational problem-solving practices. I have some examples here, which will probably make more sense later on. Let's go to this notebook. So as I said earlier, my project starts with this CSV file of 15,000 records. The records in this file were partially cleaned up, but they still needed some work. And so the first thing I did was upload them into OpenRefine. I wanted to identify all the places of worship in the data, so I started by using grell expressions to query for keywords such as church, chapel, and tabernacle. I searched for other keywords, including synagogue and mosque, but ultimately the only places of worship in the data were churches. I'll talk about that a bit later in the presentation. You can see on the screen one of the examples of one of the expressions that I used right here where my mouse is. Much of this process involved recycling expressions I'd already used or already found to try to make them work in slightly different ways. Since other than our class exercise using OpenRefine, this is the first time I used expressions. I relied a lot on internet strangers and the work that they had already done, and I used that to build off of. This part of the project was also an exercise in troubleshooting and trying to find creative ways to clean up the data. For example, as I was searching for church records, I was also accidentally capturing records about people who were related to the churches, such as, pastors, reverends, etc. I had to get creative to remove those unwanted records from my list, and you can see one of the expressions I used here, which was basically targeting any record that had reverend in the title column and removing those from the list of churches. So I ended up with 71 churches in total. And from there, I used even more grell expressions to identify the denomination of this was pretty.
I think you're cutting out a little bit.
Then
Oops.
created a new right here based on church. What did you miss? Oh. Is it better if I stop my video? Yeah, okay. So I was talking about how I created a new column with the church denominations. And so I have here my JSON file that you can upload into OpenRefine with the CSV file if you want to see all the transformations that I did and replicate them. I also included a clean CSV file that has all this new information added to the full data set. So let's move on to the next notebook. So once my data was cleaned up, I uploaded it into Tableau Public and began creating visualizations. I've summarized my findings here in the notebook, but let's scroll down to the actual Tableau story, which I've embedded here. So I will just run this. All right. So as I said, I found, let me actually make this full screen. There we go. As I said, I found 71 churches in total. This includes 41 white churches and 30 Black churches. As most of you know, the city directory denotes whether people or businesses are Black using an asterisk in the listing. So I use this denotation to determine which churches have Black congregations. On the next slide, I looked at the number of listings in the directory for Black people or businesses, which was about 30% of the total listings. I compare this against census data from 1910, which puts Charlotte's Black population at 34%. So the directory seems to be giving us a pretty accurate picture of Charlotte's demographics. Interestingly, while the Black population was about 30% of the total, the population of Black churches was about 42% of the total. This finding is also in line with research that I did, which has consistently shown since the late 19th century that Black Americans are more likely to belong to a church than white Americans. This is likely why there is a disproportionate number of Black churches to Black residents in Charlotte. This slide shows a big picture breakdown of the different church denominations. You can see that Methodist, Presbyterian, and Baptist churches account for 70% of all churches. You can also see 3 churches that fall into this other category. These were the only churches that the directory did not explicitly state the denomination. And I opted to not make any judgment calls by categorizing them. A different researcher might make another choice, but for me, I didn't want to introduce any errors that way. The next slide breaks down church denomination by race. So you can see Black churches on the left and white churches on the right. I think there are 2 interesting data points here. The first is that some denominations only have a white church or a Black church. So for instance, there's a white Catholic church, but there's no Black Catholic church. The second interesting point is the opposite. That is that some denominations have both Black and white churches. This was likely the result of either official segregation policies or just unofficial social norms. Again, this is in keeping with research that American churches were and actually still remain segregated by race. One of the most interesting things about this data to me is the records that we don't have. These reflect an archival silence or a gap in the records. These gaps can say a lot about who collected the records and who was in power. On this slide is a photograph of the United Hebrew Brotherhood, which was Charlotte's first synagogue, which will come into play shortly. As I noted earlier, I queried the data for places of worship other than churches. When I didn't find any, I decided to do a little research to make sure I wasn't missing anything in the data. What I found was that Charlotte, in fact, had a small Jewish population in 1911. However, its first synagogue wasn't built until 1916, which is why it wouldn't have been included in the directory. But in the course of my research, I came across the 1910 American Jewish Yearbook, which includes listings that look very similar to the listings in the 1911 Charlotte City Directory. You can see one of those listings here. It's for a congregation, that's what CG represents, called the Hebrew United Brotherhood. Folks in this class might recognize this format from the listings in the Charlotte City Directory. It's very similar. This is not the address of today's Hebrew United Brotherhood building, so it indicates that this was not the official synagogue building. It was just a precursor to it. Sorry. So at any rate, the Hebrew United Brotherhood is not listed in the 1911 directory, though the rabbi, let me go back, Charles Eric is listed. However, in the 1911 directory, he's identified as a reverend. There's no way of knowing from the data whether this title was given to him by the authors of the directory who didn't know what to do with a rabbi, or if he chose this title for himself. But what it does suggest is that my earlier strategy of ignoring the listings of clergymen was flawed. There could have been some clues there, and it sounds like Bethany found those in her project on the business directory, which speaks to the possibilities of teaming up and combining these projects. So once I found the listing for the Hebrew United Brotherhood in the American Jewish Yearbook, I went back to I went to look in the 1922 Charlotte City Directory. So I wanted to see another year to see if it showed up there. And it does. Let's see where my cursor is, but not under a list of houses of worship, but under a list of associations and societies. Again, the data is there to an extent, but only if you know to look for it. So let's go back to my notebook. And so I have a suggestion here for a possible project to build off of this exercise. As we discovered, something as benign as a city directory isn't necessarily free of biases, and it can contain archival silences. But we can address this by collecting data from other sources. Here I've detailed 3 steps to recreate this exercise using the 1910 Jewish American Yearbook. There are other years available on the Internet Archive as well. Just like with this exercise, we would start with raw data, clean it up in OpenRefine, and finally visualize it using Tableau Public. So that's it. Thank you so much for listening.